and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakazagawa, and this is episode 155. Today's guest is Sarah Gailey. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today, I'm pleased to welcome friend of the show, writer Sarah Gailey, back to Keep the Channel Open for a conversation about their latest novella, Have You Eaten? Sarah Gailey is a Hugo Award-winning and best-selling author of speculative fiction, short stories, and essays. They have been a finalist for the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards for multiple years running. Their best-selling adult novel debut, Magic for Liars, was published by Tor Books in 2019. Their most recent novel, Just Like Home, and most recent original comic book series with Boom Studios, Know Your Station, are available now. Their shorter works and essays have been published in Mashable, The Boston Globe, Vice, Tor.com, and The Atlantic. Their work has been translated into 7 different languages and published around the world. You can find links to their work at sarahgailey.com. So, longtime listeners will know that this is Sarah's 4th time as a guest on the show. They are one of my favorite writers and one of my favorite people, and I am just always so thrilled to get a chance to talk with them. This time, as I mentioned before, we are talking about their latest novella, which is called Have You Eaten? In this book, which was originally serialized as 4 short stories, we follow a group of young queer refugees as they make their way through a near-future America that is in the process of collapsing. In the broad strokes, that description may sound a bit like Alas, Babylon or a similar post-apocalyptic classic, but what's so interesting and vital about the approach Have You Eaten takes is that each chapter takes place in the in-between. The travel and conflict that we expect from the post-apocalyptic genre mostly takes place off-screen, and what we see instead are the quieter, more personal moments during which this little family finds ways to nourish each other, both literally and emotionally. What are the ways that we take care of each other in a crisis? That's what the story is asking. The answers are sometimes messy, sometimes imperfect, but there is a core of love in every interaction that shines through. The result is lovely, and if you haven't read it yet, I hope you will. Have You Eaten is currently available as an ebook published by Tor, and there are links in the show notes to purchase it via Kobo, Apple Books, and Amazon. It's only $2 in the US, and I found it a compelling and just wonderful read, so I hope you'll check it out. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Sarah Gailey. So how are you today?
I am doing great. I am in beautiful, sunny Oakland, California. Life is about as good as it has ever been. I don't know, I'm really feeling the joy of existence lately in a way that I haven't in any other time in my life, and I'm damn happy about it.
I cannot express to you how glad I am to hear you say that. I'm so glad, too, that I got a chance to read this novella. And I've been thinking about it a lot in sort of the context of all of the other of your work that I've read. So, I mean, I've read every book that you have published, and I have read a good chunk of your short fiction as well. And so I guess sort of one of the first things that I was thinking about is sort of the difference between writing shorter fiction versus writing novels. Something that I was thinking about, the most obvious thing for me reading this one is just sort of how it is a little more experimental in form than novels usually get to be. Whereas I'm thinking about some of your past short fiction, like your story Stet from, I think that was 2018. You get to play with form a lot more in the shorter pieces. But I'm sort of curious for you, like what it is that pulls you in one direction or the other, what you find interesting about one type of story, one length of story versus another, how it changes things for you as the author.
Oh my gosh. You know what? I'm so happy that you are pointing out the way that I, at least, am a lot more experimental with form and formality in short fiction. To me, it's a lot like the difference between doing a voice, like when you're talking and you start putting on a particularly silly voice, doing a voice for a joke versus doing voice for a character that you're performing for an extended amount of time. It's a lot harder to sustain the experimentation in form over a long structure. It's a lot easier, for me at least, to experiment with form and get risky with it in a shorter narrative because I'm not trying to keep as many chainsaws in the air, you know? In a short piece, there's going to be a lot fewer plot lines, a lot fewer twists of character, and a lot fewer moving parts. And so it's a lot easier to keep my eye on all those moving parts while I'm doing something different than what I've ever done before. And this, this novella is particularly experimental on a few levels. It's serialized as 4 short stories, and originally it was going to be quite a bit longer. It was going to be novel length serialized, and as the pitch developed and as things changed on the publisher's side, and as things changed with the editor that I was working with at the start of this, the scope of the story had to change. And as a result, the amount of capacity I had in terms of word count and installments of this serial shrank. And as that happened, the amount of experimentation and risk that I wanted to engage with became concentrated. And so maybe it's less that I get more experimental, and it's more that the amount of experimentation I'm doing becomes focused in shorter work. I think as a writer, I do always want to take risks and try unexpected things. And when I'm working in a very tight word count, the amount of space I have for risk becomes smaller. And I think, do you know about the difference between vine-ripened tomatoes and shelf-ripened tomatoes?
I mean, not in a technical sense. I would love to hear if you have. Yeah,
I'm about to be so on my bullshit, Mike. This being my 4th time on the show, you are getting the unhinged Gailey experience, I think.
This is the best. This is what I was hoping for.
So the reason vine-ripened tomatoes taste better than shelf-ripened tomatoes is because as the tomato ripens, as it's like sitting on the vine, right? It can sit on the vine for a long time. I had tomatoes that I've left on the vine for a very long time because the plant was doing its process, right? It was like in tomato making mode. And being in Southern California, where I've been for the last several years, I was living in a particular pocket of climate where my tomato plants would make flowers almost all year round. And as long as they were still flowering, I could leave the tomatoes on the vine. And the only thing that would happen is that maybe a gopher would come and take a bite out of one, which, fine, that's their business. But as the tomato plant detects changes in temperature and moisture, it starts to shift its focus. It starts to say, okay, it's time for me to stop focusing on making flowers and making more tomatoes and start focusing on putting my roots deeper into the soil so I can be really well established so that I can survive whatever is about to come, whether that's dropping temperatures or change in moisture, whatever. So as that process occurs, the plant has to change where it's putting its resources. And it starts taking resources away from the parts that you and I look at all the time, away from leaves. So you might have some leaves drop and you might have some branches die. And of course, in that process, away from flowers and tomatoes. And when this begins, that's when you begin to have your tomatoes rapidly ripening. They've been growing. They've been getting all this moisture and all these nutrients that the plant is using to make them. And then the plant starts taking resources away from the tomatoes. And most importantly, it starts taking moisture away from the tomatoes. It starts using that water for other processes, whether it's focusing on different tomatoes or focusing on healing a branch that's been cut or focusing on putting down those roots deeper. It starts taking moisture away. And that concentrates the sugars inside of the tomato. So if you leave your tomato to ripen on the vine, it will ripen as excess water is taken out of it by the plant. And that concentrates the flavor, concentrates the sugars. You get a much, much sweeter and more flavorful tomato. Whereas if you ripen it on the shelf, it's just ripening by a process of, cell degradation, essentially. No changes are occurring within the sugars in the tomato. No changes are occurring within the moisture content unless God help you store it in the refrigerator, and then it turns into like a half raisin. And that is the process by which tomatoes become good. That's the process by which a lot of fruit becomes sweeter when it ripens where it's meant to ripen. Not all fruit is like this. Like, for example, persimmons, you can ripen on the counter, and it's actually kind of more desirable because harvesting a truly ripe persimmon is a wretched experience. And I think there's some varieties that can't ripen without being harvested. That is completely so far afield. You don't need any of that information. The point is, I think of short fiction as having less water in it, the way that a vine-ripened tomato does, which isn't to say that long fiction isn't ripe. It's just that it has more liquid for you to disperse the flavor of your experimentation in. And better writers than me can get the same concentration of experimentation that I have in my short fiction in their long fiction. I don't have that degree of skill yet, and I'm hungry for it. Every time I start a new project, I'm trying to find out how much experimentation I can put in there. And the novel that I have coming out in 2026, which I cannot say almost jack shit about yet, have more formal experimentation in it than any other novel I've written before. It petrifies me. And it's still not even close to the level of formal experimentation that other authors are capable of. But for me personally, like, that's what the difference is, I think, in terms of formality and what I'm able to do in short fiction, and why in this project I was able to get so experimental because the project shrank. And so it was like, okay, shit, well, I've got to be putting all of that risk into just 4 short stories.
I love that we're going into food metaphors because it's very apt for this particular project. As you were talking before the I don't want to call it a digression, but before we started talking about tomatoes, the thing that came up for me was like reducing a sauce and getting all those flavors a little more concentrated. I was thinking about, again, this story in the context of your other work that I've read. And, for example, in the last time that you were on the show where we were talking about your work was when I had you on to talk about When We Were Magic. And one of the things I'd really loved about that book was the way that the characters take care of each other, where there isn't really this focus on sort of the intra-group conflict that you might see in other YA novels. And I feel like this is something that's similar in this story. But actually, the thing that most came to mind for me as I was reading this story, and this is going to be kind of an obvious comparison, but is your Stone Soup newsletter. And in particular, there's a couple of older ones that came to mind for me. The ones that I'm thinking of are from, when is this from? I'm not sure exactly. So this one's from 2020, and it's called Mending Sauce. And that one itself references the other one that I was thinking of, which was the Pantry Cookies one, which is from the end of 2019. Both of these newsletter entries that you wrote are ostensibly about cooking. They are recipes in a very similar way to the way that this story has recipes in it, and how much of the action of each of the constituent stories revolves around cooking. But both of these newsletter items that you wrote, they're not just about cooking. It's more like that the cooking is giving you the opportunity to explore something else, whether that might be how grief can come out of you at times when you wouldn't necessarily expect, or in the case of the Mending Sauce one, and this is the part that feels so applicable to me in terms of this story, how cooking can be a way of taking care of each other. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to read out of this Mending Sauce newsletter. You wrote at one point, This isn't just about eating. I've written before about the way cooking can draw grief up out of a person. Every step of a recipe can be significant. If you let it, the transformative process of creating a meal can begin the process of mending your heart. And later on, I mean, there's a lot of these little moments throughout this recipe, but the one that really jumped out for me is where you're talking about essentially caramelizing tomatoes as part of this sauce. And you're saying to just leave them and let them sit. And you say, it will feel wrong. It will go against all your instincts, letting those tomatoes sit and sizzle in the pan, knowing that they're changing in ways you'd normally try to avoid. You can sit in that wrong feeling and come out on the other side of it intact. I promise you can. And I mean, aside from just the fact that there's something so lovely about, offering this recipe to one of your readers in a way that it just feels so loving and caring, but also how the story is sort of enacting a kind of the same thing, if that makes sense. Can we, I know that's not exactly a question, but does anything jump out for you about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these two pieces that you're referring to were both part of the thinking that led to Have You Eaten? During that time, late 2019, which is when I believe that's when I wrote and published the pantry cookies recipe. I wrote that after a friend's partner's funeral. A very, very dear friend of mine had their partner pass away quite unexpectedly. And, this person was not nearly as big a part of my life as they were of my friend's life. But I was still experiencing the private grief that I think anyone experiences when death steps into their life in any way. The grief of even just recognizing the impact of death and the magnitude of loss that death represents. And I was hosting another friend who had come for the funeral. And we went back to my house after the funeral together, and we were, kind of talking about this experience of this person, we were at the funeral to support our friend who was going through a huge loss, a momentous, life-changing loss. But it touches us. It's still, we still feel our feelings. And so we were supporting each other in that circle of care of we're at similar levels of intimacy and loss. So we aren't putting this on our friend who's grieving, but we can support each other. And I said I need to do something with my hands and went into the kitchen and just started making cookies. But I didn't have the ingredients for any specific kind of cookie. And so I opened up my cupboard and started using whatever bullshit, crumbs were in there as cookie ingredients, like potato chips from a half-eaten bag and pretzels and M&Ms and, coconut shreds and stuff. And as I was making these, I ended up making 5 dozen cookies by accident. I just kept going and going and going. And then all of a sudden I looked and there were all these fucking cookies in my kitchen. And my friend who I was talking to while I was making this, and I talked the entire time about death and grief, and we made jokes and we cried. And it was this experience of food as expression of immense emotion. And I wrote about it for that pantry cookies recipe. And then the same thing happened with this mending sauce recipe. And that was in 2020. Obviously, things were not easy. And I had been thinking a lot about food and community at that time. I believe when I published Mending Sauce, I had already run the Stone Soup series. Is that right? Didn't that come out? Didn't I publish Mending Sauce in August or September?
It was in May.
In May. Okay, yeah. So that was right in the middle of the Stone Soup series that I was running, which was it was like a recipe advice column that I started during lockdown for people to tell me what ingredients in their pantry they didn't know how to cook with, because we all have that, right? We all have a friend gave you a soup mix that they bought for their kids' school fundraiser, and you're like, what am I going to do with this soup mix? Either it doesn't seem appealing, or I don't know how to cook it, or whatever. And so people would email me with the ingredients that they didn't know how to cook with, and I would write a little recipe for them. And that became a mechanism of food as community care. You know, during the Black Lives Matter protests, I wrote a bit about how to cook food that you could bring to a protest and give to people who were exhausted from doing the important work they were doing all day, or how you could make a meal that would feed people who needed a place to crash because the entire neighborhood was locked down. The National Guard occupied Los Angeles, where I lived at that time, and there were people who couldn't go home and who needed to just go into somebody's house and say, I'm here for the night. What do you have that can sustain me? And so when I wrote Mending Sauce, I was thinking about that too. I was thinking about the way we cook for each other to heal each other's hearts and to provide for each other's needs in moments of crisis. And that was when I pitched Have You Eaten for the first time. I contacted my publisher, I believe within a day of writing that Mending Sauce piece, and said, I have a project I want to do. I want to talk about social collapse, not through the lens of adventure and revolution, but through the lens of the way people show up for each other while that collapse is ongoing, while the revolution is happening, while the asteroid is coming to strike the Earth, while we are in a state of disaster. This is something that I feel so passionately about. Mike, I'm sure I've talked with you about this before, and I think every person I know is already sick of hearing about it, but I have a captive audience in your audience right now, so I'm just going to do it again. There's this concept that's commonly referred to as disaster socialism. And we're actually, as you and I are recording this right now, a massive hurricane is striking the U.S. Southeast, and we're about to see disaster socialism in action. There's a conception among like libertarian survivalist types, you know, people who hoard distilled water in bunkers near their homes and stockpile ammunition in order to keep people away from what they've collected. And their understanding of disaster and social collapse is that you have to fight for everything you have and protect everything you have and guard your resources and don't let anybody else touch your fucking stuff, right? And that idea is based on no connection to actual human reality, because the reality we've seen time and time again, over and over, in every part of the world, under every awful circumstance, is that when disaster strikes, people automatically help each other. When someone's house gets torn apart by a tornado, their neighbors show up and help them clear the debris. When a huge earthquake strikes, for example, 1989 San Francisco, people aren't hoarding and clutching their bottled water and fighting over, you know, who gets to use the toilet. People instead bring each other bottled water, bring each other food, come check on each other, because that's the nature of humans. We are an interdependent social species, and we will kind of hit pause on our differences and our conflicts and even our hatred of each other when disaster strikes all of us. We come to help each other. And that is, unfortunately, one of the signs of a community recovering from a disaster is when those petty conflicts start to come back into play. It's like, okay, well, now you're healed enough to be mean again. But, you know, this is like a very well observed and recorded condition of humanity. Mm. And I wanted to write about that and about the small ways that manifests when people are struggling and hurting, and especially when society forces people to be in a constant state of struggle through, you know, fascistic design. People help each other, and one of the first things that we do to help each other is feed each other.
Yeah. Sort of like the, you know, when you have a personal tragedy and your neighbors come over with a casserole or whatever, it's actually, I don't know that my neighbors would do that, but people have done that for me, just not the ones that live directly next door to me.
Well, it depends on how well you know your neighbors, right? And sometimes your community is not your neighbors. I recently lived in a place where, due to COVID, I moved in during COVID and didn't get to meet my neighbors because all of us were immunocompromised, and so none of us were leaving the house. We left notes in each other's mailboxes saying, "Hey, sorry, I'm I'm not trying to be rude to you. I just don't want to die.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, it's ongoing, right? Everybody is getting COVID lately. There's a huge surge. There's a new variant. The old vaccines can't keep up with it. And everyone I know, I think almost everyone I know has gotten COVID within the last month and a half. And one of the first things we all ask in the group chat is, do you need soup? It's like automatic. How can I nourish your body in your time of suffering? How can I meet your most basic need? It's constant.
Yeah. I'm thinking about how, you know, one of the things that you mentioned here, dystopian fiction is so often about the adventure of it and the revolutionary aspect of it. And this one is not about that. We don't even really find out what the nature of the apocalypse here is. There are some sort of things that are mentioned slantwise or implied that we can kind of glean, but it's almost kind of not really relevant what it is, you know? And what this kind of makes me think of is, I mean, I don't know, we're talking about things like fascism and pandemics and things, and obviously, you know, political stuff, climate stuff, it's all relevant, right? And a looking towards the future of what that might look like afterwards. And I guess there's something too that when I'm thinking about a story like this, I'm also thinking about it in a less literal, maybe more metaphorical way. You know, in the pre-show, we talked about the fact that I went through a breakup recently, but even before that, you know, 3-ish years ago, I went through a divorce, and that was really traumatic for me. And it was a time in my life where I didn't know how I was going to get through it, and how I ended up getting through it was people that I felt like I barely even knew would just sort of text me, say, hey, come out to lunch with me today. And so I would. How there is sort of, I mean, I don't want to like blow it out of proportion in like global terms, but there is a way in which something like that is a sort of apocalypse, even if it's only on a personal scale. It is a sort of collapse of your life, and how community works even in a situation like that. There's something about a story like this that I feel like what is amazing about it is that it's showing you what it looks like, you know, that we get very few representations, whether it's in media or literature or just in life, of what would it look like. I've been an activist since early 2017, and there's a lot in terms of, you know, how do we fight? How do we take action? How do we take direct action? And these are important things to think about and to do. But what does it look like to be in community? What does it look like to take care of each other? What does it look like to show up? I think these are things that a lot of us don't necessarily have answers for, especially not in terms of the apocalyptic and the post-apocalyptic, but in terms of something a little more personal. It might be easier to get your hands around, and the realization that those are the same, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're hitting on two really deep wells here, one of which is the question of apocalypse, and the other of which is the question of life. Is the question of apocalypse. This is actually something that I was a pain in the publisher's ass about, because for marketing purposes, calling this a post-apocalyptic story is easily the best move, right? That is the label that will make this sell. But I was quite insistent that we try as much as possible to avoid using the language of apocalypse, because apocalypse is the end of things. And the reason that the quote-unquote apocalypse feels vague in this is because nothing has ended. It's ongoing. It's 5 minutes into the future of the United States, depending on what happens this November, maybe less than 5 minutes. And it's about, you know, the same thing that our everyday life is about. How do I navigate the world that I'm living in, which has been constructed in a way that is antithetical to my thriving? Here's a world in which I cannot, in Have You Eaten, here's a world in which I, as a queer person, can't pass freely across state borders. And then here in the world today that you and I are living in, Mike, as we're recording this yesterday, I read a report from a journalist who I do trust as a source of information, about a border wall or fence that Texas just constructed along the border with New Mexico to prevent free travel into the state and out of the state. This is something that people in that area are going to have to navigate and are going to have to figure out how to cope with. And the reason for restricting border crossing is never liberatory. It's not like we want to make sure that we give universal basic income to everybody who crosses this border, so make sure you stop at the border so we can check to see that we gave you access to free and safe abortions. Like, that's not what's happening here. It's always restrictive. It's always limiting. And those limitations are something that we very quickly adjust to and figure out how to cope with. This is one of the ways in which human nature enables fascism. It's not because it's our nature to oppress each other. It's because it's our nature to adjust to new circumstances and cope with them. And so as we get more and more oppressed and restricted, we learn how to cope and care for each other so quickly that sometimes we forget that the changes are even happening. The characters in Have You Eaten aren't sitting here reminiscing about the way things used to be and how much easier life used to be for queer people. They're saying, oh, here's where it's safe for us to go now. We have to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
So that's one thing you're touching on is, like, you know, I've also been through a divorce. And at the time, my experience of it was as a personal apocalypse. It was devastating. It was traumatic. It was harrowing. It was a logistical nightmare. And now I'm on the other side of it, having learned to cope and adjust to the life in which none of my reality is what it was supposed to be when I married the person I married. I think that's what apocalypses really are, right? Unless the planet explodes and we're all dead, which is kind of a different scale of thing. Apocalypse is the complete and total annihilation of the circumstance you anticipated would continue forever. And frankly, that happened in 1986. That happened in 2016. It may happen to us in a couple of months. It may happen to us in a few years. We undergo apocalypse all the time. And this Have You Eaten is really the story of, like, I guess in that sense, yeah, sure, it's post-apocalyptic, but there's no real such thing as apocalypse is being over, because the destruction of your anticipated circumstance will happen again. And it's only our immense resilience and the support of our communities that make that survivable. And then to your other point, yeah, one of the things that bothers me about a lot of revolutionary, like especially liberal and neoliberal revolutionary fantasy, is that it is about the fight. It's about activism as being prepared for battle, focused on battle, and in battle. And it's ultimately very informed by imperialistic, militaristic notions of heroism, the necessity of violence, and the like nobility of the soldier, right? But you and I both know that people who get lost in that sauce, who are constantly like about the fight and about the struggle, forget about the other part, which is, how do you live? Day to day, how do you live? You come home from the protest, and there are dishes that need to be done in the sink of your collective. And there are people who you live with who are working all day in trade or in tech or fucking whatever, using their body for labor so that they can sustain themselves in the structure under which we operate, and they don't have time to cook themselves dinner. Are you going to take care of that? Are you going to be there for the people who are with you, living alongside you, while you're engaged in your glorious battle? And, you know, I get, this is going to be shocking information. I get pretty pissed at people who don't think that way, who are so focused on their own importance in struggle that they forget that the struggle is collective, not just in that we are struggling collectively, but in that we are struggling for the right of the collective to thrive. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think also there is, you know, to your point about this sort of, you know, libertarian exaltation of the soldier kind of thing. I mean, the uplifting of the primacy of the individual over the collective. You know, a lot of that too has to do with the refusal to recognize feminized labor as important, you know, to think that something like cooking a meal or taking care of the people who are close to you, or even the people who might be physically distant from you, but emotionally close to you, that this is not also not just a form of resistance, but a necessary and vital part of that whole effort, right?
Yes, I mean, for fuck's sake, an army travels on its stomach, right? We have to keep each other fed and watered and rested and sheltered and clothed in order to continue the fight. And I frankly, this is another way in which I think that hyper focus on the fight tends to end up being neoliberal folly, because it assumes that the struggle will ever end. It assumes that we are working toward some achievable, satisfactory end game. And it doesn't acknowledge the struggle for liberation as an ecosystem. We have a necessary ecosystem to maintain in the push toward liberation, and that ecosystem has to include people who are fighting and people who are working to make sure that the people who are fighting don't die of hunger and exhaustion. We tend to ennoble the idea of struggle and suffering going hand in hand, which is understandable and honestly quite strategic, because struggle often does involve suffering. It involves giving things up. It involves, having to endure discomfort. But we get so focused on the discomfort that we start to think it's the goal, and we start to think that it has nobility to it, and we start to think that it enhances the accomplishments we're working toward. And honestly, I mean, this is like Protestant bullshit, Get it out of here.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've seen any number of very prominent activists, people who have been in it for a long time, say things like, I believe, the first person I'm thinking of who I'm sure I've seen saying things like this would be Mariam Kaba, talking about how it's not enough to just be against things, that you have to think about what it is that you love and what it is that you're trying to build. And that is, I mean, that's something that I think a lot of this kind of activists that you're talking about often, isn't thinking about what are the things, who are the people that I love? What does it mean to care for that? What does it mean to nurture and make that garden grow, right? But that
Yes.
is, if you don't know what you're trying to move towards, then how could you ever even get close to it?
Absolutely. I mean, I do have great compassion for where this mindset comes from. Anger is an empowering emotion. Anger makes us feel strong and focused, and hatred, not to quote Yoda here, but, hatred, it is a driving force of anger. Anger is a driving force of hatred. Those two go together. And so when you find something that you hate and you want to fight against it, you get into this very angry place. You get into this place of focusing on, like you said, what you're against. And it makes you feel less scared of what happens if you lose. And it makes you feel less scared of what happens if you get hurt. If your body gets hurt because you're working against something, it's a lot less scary if you're entirely focused on that thing you're against. If you forget that you have someone who you love, who's at home hoping you come home safe, if you forget that, then it's a lot easier to throw your body into the struggle. But it's not sustainable, and at the end of that struggle, if you make it out and you've forgotten what you're going to go home to, you're going to feel lost. And that especially is when people get taken advantage of. That's when people get turned toward goals that they don't truly believe in because all they have left is pursuit of the goal. And it's easy to turn someone's head in that moment. It's also easy to discourage them. It's easy to discourage people who forget what it's like to care deeply about something from a place of tenderness and connection instead of a place of violence.
Yeah. So before we close the first segment, I mean, it's always funny to me how, like, no matter how long or short a piece is that I'm talking about on this show, like, I never run out of stuff to talk. I always run out of time before I run out of stuff to talk about.
Such a good problem to have.
Yeah. There's sort of two things that I'm thinking of, and we can talk about either or both. So one is sort of just a technical thing about the way the story is constructed, and that is about the narration and the point of view of the narration, because it's in third person, and it's sort of in an omniscient third person, but it's not a neutral third person. You know, like the narrator has a voice, even if the narrator isn't a character. You know, like there's a point at which, you know, the narrator says, but still, damn, it must have stung to hear. You know, that little damn in there it's like it's a part of a voice that is not like God's voice. And yet we are still going into each of these characters' heads. We get to see what Fen is thinking. We get to see what Morrow is thinking. And I had some thoughts about that and the particular way that the narrator's voice is constructed that we could talk about. The other thing that I thought was interesting was about, you know, in terms of form, is how, you know, you have at the top and bottom of each of the sections, you have the recipe, and it's the same recipe, except that the top one is how the recipe was received, and the bottom one is how it was implemented at this moment and how it was adapted. And there's something about adapting recipes. You and I are both people who take our home cooking as like it's a source of both sustenance and pleasure. It's something that I know both of us enjoy and take a certain amount of pride in, and find it as an outlet for expression, perhaps. And there's something for me about adapting a recipe, about knowing how to adapt a recipe, that I find really satisfying, and seeing how that plays out in this novella feels very relevant to the sort of overall, the structure of it, and if there's a message, the message of it, that kind of thing. So either one of these things, or both, which one sounds more interesting to you?
Let's do both. Let's start with the narrative structure, though. One of the reasons among many that I love talking with you about work like this is that you spot everything, and it is so satisfying and refreshing to be like, yeah, I did think a lot about that, and now I finally get to talk to someone about it. Well, I mean, where do you want to start with this narrative structure? Or do you just want me to ramble?
I guess the thing that I'm thinking about with, well, first of all, I'm very gratified to know that I'm a good reader. Thank you very much. I feel like I've gotten my gold star, and that's very important for a person that has the kind of social anxiety that I do. But there's something about the use of this narrative voice and the fact that it is omniscient, the fact that we're not in like a close or a closely limited third person, that if this story is about community, if it is about family in some form, that it feels like being able to actually see from everyone's perspective, but also having this sort of outside voice that has a perspective on what people are thinking and feeling and doing, feels like a way of the story trying to put its arms around the characters, if that makes sense. But I don't know how that strikes you.
Yeah, that is absolutely a wonderful way of putting that. You know, with this omniscient third voice, I did want to give the readers kind of just insight into the dynamics of the group, because this is really the story of this little group of friends. And I wanted to invoke that feeling that you get when you're in a group of people who you know very intimately, and you can see the dynamics between them. You can see, oh, this one person interrupted this other person one too many times, and so now there's tension. But person B, when they get butthurt about something, is inclined to just go away and keep themselves isolated for a little while instead of saying what they're hurt about. And so person A is going to be confused about where person B went and won't know what to do about it. And I kind of wanted to invoke that sense of intimate observation. And then also, each installment really focuses on the interiority of one character. You get interiority across the board every time, but each installment is sort of about how one of the people is working on growing. And the thing is, we grow and heal in relationship. We don't grow and heal in isolation. People who take themselves and isolate themselves and say, I'm going to go and think as hard as I can about how to be a better, different person, and then I'll come back and, socialize with people once I'm a better person, are unfortunately setting themselves up for failure. This is part of the reason that I absolutely do not believe in the kind of carceral mindset of ostracism as solution to problematic behavior. I think that there are people who I won't have in my life because of the way they've treated me, but I do not believe that those people should be alone and should never get to be around anybody, and that any community they try to participate in should be prepared to ostracize them at any time due to revelations of past behaviors, because it's impossible for us to transform ourselves into different people when we're all by ourselves. We can think that we've transformed, but then the rubber meets the road and we're in community again, and we find out who we are and who we've become. And that's what this novella is kind of exploring. It's like, okay, all these people are growing. They're changing, and they know they need to change, or they find out they need to change. And they bring that desire to be different to each other. In the first story, we're looking at a person whose anxiety in friendships causes them to be inconsistent with how they show up for people. And that causes a problem in their community. And they learn that they need to be a little more courageous and a little more, as I learned this last year, a little more prepared for people to be annoyed at them. And that it's fine. Like, they need to be able to navigate conflict with their friends in a way that trusts the friendships will survive. That's not something that you can change about yourself in isolation. That only changes in relationship. And so I wanted to give the reader this sense of, watching their friends grow and change because of and in community with each other. And so I picked this almost impossible to write voice to do it.
I feel like, this is something I mentioned on Blue Sky, maybe a week ago, that there is something that I always find about your work, this sort of tenderness towards the characters that I find just so lovely. But in this one, it's also the tenderness that they have towards each other. And I think the thing that feels the most aspirational to me about it is the way in which the characters are able to express, or rather the way that the story demonstrates that these people are really willing to grow and change. Sometimes in real life that feels almost like a fantasy. It feels almost like it's a thing that doesn't happen in the real world, that people actually apologize to each other and mean it, or that they are curious about each other rather than judgmental, or that they are willing to say, here is a thing that I did that hurt you, and I'm sorry, and I'm going to try not to do it anymore. And then they do try. Sometimes that feels really rare, And I know in some ways, maybe in the aggregate, it's not rare, but because people do things like that all the time. But at least in the context of one person's life, it can feel like there aren't many people that do that. And seeing the ways that these characters do that for each other is fantastic. I don't know what the right word is.
No, I think I completely agree with you that it is rare I think actually it's rare in the aggregate for people to habitually engage in these behaviors. In part because they require, you and I were talking about this before we started recording, they require courage and vulnerability and willingness to engage with discomfort and with fear of rejection. Those are some of the hardest things to face down as a person, I think. You know, when I have to go to someone and say, hey, I fucked up and I hurt you and I'm sorry and I don't want to do it again. It's scary because what if that person says, you know what, you did fuck up and hurt me and I'm not going to give you a chance to repair going forward. You know, that happens to me, and when it has happened, it's been one of the most painful experiences of my life. So it makes total sense to me that a lot of people would prefer to sit in, you know, just sort of hoping that the problem will be forgotten, or that the other person's feelings will turn out not to be as real as their own. I think that's something that a lot of people maybe wouldn't want to admit they experience, but do. It's like, hey, maybe that person who I hurt, maybe their pain isn't as real as the pain I would feel if we talked about it. So we'll pick the one that's less real and we'll sit in that. And that said, I found this phenomenon in my observation. I'm going to talk about a different phenomenon for a second because it's, I think, an easier reference point than this one, which is very abstract and strange. I've noticed that within masculine friendships, there tends to be a reflective fear of emotional intimacy and honesty. I've noticed that a lot of people who are socially masculine will go and socialize together, and then when they're reporting on that socialization, what they'll say is, you know, oh, we shot the shit. Yeah, I don't know, we just chatted. We talked about, you know, a sports thing or politics. And in response to the question, like, okay, but how is he feeling lately? There's nothing. But when one member of a masculine cohort starts to engage in emotionally vulnerable ways, it opens up the space for everybody to do that. And suddenly you end up with a masculine cohort that is emotionally interdependent in healthy ways, supportive, honest, and vulnerable. And I think this is true. The same phenomenon is true across cohorts when it comes to honest and open conflict and apology. A friend of mine, who I will not name because she would hate it if I did, but who is very dear to me, often self-describes as like a hater and cranky and a huge bitch, which is something that I also often describe myself as, I think more accurately than she does. And she is the first person who introduced me to the idea that I could talk about something I like, and she could be like, oh, I don't like that thing. Here are my reasons. The reasons are legitimate criticisms. But that doesn't mean that I respect you less for liking it, and I think it's cool that you like it. And she means it. It's not a pass ag, like, oh, well, I guess you're into that. Like, no, it's, you know, she'll think that something is corny or heavy-handed or obvious. And then she'll say, that's my opinion, though, but you like that thing. And it is this thing that introduced very healthy amounts of conflict and disagreement, and even my friend can be irritated by the thing that I do without that meaning that they respect me less or love me less. That was life-changing to me, and that made it easier for me to acknowledge, like, oh, hey, the thing that I did, was that just annoying to you? You know, does that mean I'm going to stop doing the thing? How much am I going to accommodate your desires? Versus how much am I going to trust that you're able to tolerate some discomfort as a result of being in proximity to another human being? I think that when we do that, when we engage in that open conflict, and that kind of healthy sense of, yeah, people irritate each other sometimes, we stop dehumanizing each other in our relationships, and we stop dehumanizing ourselves, because it's dehumanizing to expect yourself to never be annoying to another person, to expect that you'll never step on someone else's toes. That you just want to be a fucking laundry hamper at that point, you know? And like, respect to laundry hampers, but that's not what you and I were put on this earth to be. And I think, you know, I think that's like something that we can extend to each other and extend to ourselves, and I think it can really transform communities when we do.
Yeah. So for the second segment, I always invite my guests to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Well, Mike, I would like to talk about a conversation that you and I had recently when we first recorded this episode. So for your listeners, Mike and I recorded the second half of this episode a couple of days ago. And after the conversation, I contacted Mike and I said, I'm not totally comfortable with how I handled that conversation. I don't really feel like I was being caring and responsible with some of the subject matter in the way that I prefer to normally. And Mike very generously was open to us approaching this again and kind of revisiting it. And I want to acknowledge something because it really kind of goes with all the conversations that you and I have been having, Mike, which is that part of why I had to come to that realization after we finished recording is because I feel a level of comfort with you as a person that makes me okay with being a little more messy and a little less careful and kind of trusting that you will go into that mess with me with the understanding and expectation that you and I are both caring, thoughtful people. That said, your listeners don't know me at all. And so it really is a situation where I didn't say anything that I don't believe in or anything that I think is ethically or morally wrong, but I did say things in a way that was relying kind of on the trust within our friendship as opposed to the kind of public presentation of idea that being on a podcast interview represents. So on the one hand, I apologize for taking more of your time to revisit this. And on the other hand, I'm not that sorry because it's always good to have a conversation that goes along those lines with someone who you can go into the mess with.
It is something, that I think about a lot. I have been told a lot of times, even by people that don't know me that well, that there's something about my affect and the tone of my voice, just the way my voice sounds, that's very soothing, and that it is kind of disarming, and that it makes people feel safe. And it is something that I think kind of works to the benefit of a show like this, where I am trying to have intimate conversations with people that sort of go beyond the standard, literary book tour kind of interviews that everybody does. But I think that there is also, in just the way that you're saying, a way in which it requires a certain amount of additional care on my part. One of the things that I always tell people when we're about to start recording is that I don't do a lot of content editing, but that, if there's anything that the guest feels uncomfortable with at any point, just to let me know. And I'll make sure that, we do whatever needs to be done in order to make sure that everybody feels good about what we're doing. It strikes me that there is something that really goes along with what we were talking about in the first segment about have you eaten, about the ways in which we take care of each other, right? That, that story, that book is all about the way that people in relationship show up for each other and what community looks like and how do we nourish each other and make sure that each other are cared for. I think that there's a particular responsibility when it comes to being an interview host and more broadly with being a good literary citizen and with being a good friend that it requires a certain amount of thinking about how can I make sure that I'm taking care of the people who I'm in contact with. So, I don't know exactly how to turn that into a question, but it is something that I was thinking about a little bit in the last couple of days, how this also kind of ties in with what we were already talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and this is sort of the subject that I brought up that I had felt earlier that I didn't necessarily approach with quite enough care, is that part of being in community with people and caring for people is extending them the opportunity to take risks in conversations and in interpersonal dynamics, and then when those risks don't go the way that they'd hoped, to say, hey, I messed that up. Let me try again. Let me try to be a better version of myself. Let me try to find my way to the communication that I want to be representing. This is something that I often do with my friends when they, I'll see the kind of record needle skip for a minute where they'll go, I don't know how to talk about this the right way. And I'll often say, hey, what if we try talking about it the wrong way, and then we can find our way to the right way? And I find that I find it so useful because it says, listen, you can say something incorrectly or in a way that doesn't align with your true feelings, and use that to find your way to your true feelings and find your way to the place that your heart sits and where that intersects with what your mouth says.
Yeah.
Which is, a kind of a scary thing to approach in a public space. I try to represent myself, especially in interviews like this, quite authentically. I am never saying things that I don't mean or don't believe. But I am always trying to present a version of those thoughts and feelings that is final and complete as possible. Because complete strangers are going to be listening to these thoughts who have no context for who I am, no reason to trust my intentions, and who are quite correctly cautious of people who say any number of things. And I think it is a very different space to inhabit than the space that you share with your friends where you say, can I just be messy for a moment? Or I'll often say this to my friends, can I say something incredibly bitchy with the understanding that I still have compassion in my heart? And there's a gulf between the way that kind of question is acceptable with people who know you versus the way it's acceptable with people who don't know you. It's the difference between someone holding space for you to be a complete human being who has imperfect thoughts and ideas and feelings versus someone learning exactly how much they should trust the next thing you say in that moment.
I think it's always a very tough thing, for sure.
All this is to say thank you, Mike, for letting me do a second take and step out of the space where I am exploring the mess and a little more into the space where I can be talking both to you and to your wonderful audience. Also, I'm gonna dogpile on you for a minute. Okay. I'm gonna be so mean to you. I'm gonna add to, this thing that people have told you about your voice being soothing, which is true. You have a lovely voice. You have a wonderful voice for podcasting and radio, especially. However, I personally tend to, I have an instinctive aversion to trusting someone's voice. And the reason that I feel comfortable exploring mess with you is because of the person you have demonstrated yourself to be over many years. I have watched you personally grow huge emotional and mental and intellectual muscles in the area of exploring uncomfortable topics, ideas, and dynamics with a very strongly rooted moral and ethical lens. I don't know if you personally know this. There may be an observer effect thing here, but I'm quite reserved with most people in exploring messy subjects. There are very few people in my life with whom I will say, all right, I'm going to risk screwing this up in front of you. And the people who do get to that place with me are people who have demonstrated themselves many times to be capable of holding a dialectic, of knowing that two things can be true at the same time, of understanding that philosophical and academic ideas about morality and correctness are often in friction with lived experience. And that's something that I have seen in you and really admire. So, take that. That's my bullying you for today.
You're actually going to make me cry here.
I'm a terrible podcast guest. I show up, say, hey, can we re-record, and then make you cry.
I need a second. It's very gratifying to hear, especially because, I'm the kind of person who tends to feel like if I'm not directly in someone's line of sight that they forget that I exist. But, I do try really hard. And so having that be acknowledged is really meaningful, especially for someone who I respect and admire as much as I do you. I think that there is something about what you're saying. There's something, I guess what I'm trying to think about is how do we get to the point of trusting other people? And so for the listeners' context, the thing that we were talking about the first time we recorded was the sort of necessity of interpersonal repair and sort of the difference between community ways of addressing issues and interpersonal ways of addressing issues. And it's something that I think a lot about, especially because, or maybe not especially because, but, one way that this comes up for me a lot is that I've mentioned this to you before, and I think you probably knew this about me anyway, but that I spend a lot of time on TikTok, on social media in general, but lately especially on TikTok. And there's this dynamic that happens on TikTok that is not new to that particular platform, but there is something that feels sort of especially heightened about the dynamic, where it's very difficult for people to let people be wrong about things or to give them the opportunity, to give them the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes even people with whom, maybe it's someone who you have been following for a while. And I end up thinking a lot about how, well, one, especially on that platform, the average age of the people both making and consuming content there is very, very young. And a lot of the people who are talking about stuff and sort of setting the terms of discourse there simply were not around on social media 10, 15 years ago to sort of see the cycle of how these things go on, how it went on Twitter, for example, or even before that, how it went in the LiveJournal days or, in blogging days. And that's part of it. But just in general, that there is so much of a difficulty with letting people who have any kind of a public face just be people who maybe sometimes say things that are not exactly in accordance with their values and beliefs, or, maybe sometimes that they have something that they need to learn about and that they need to be able to have that moment of growth. And it's such a difficult thing sometimes to know how to balance that sort of tension between taking care of your own mental health, your own emotional health, your own boundaries, and knowing how to push back on things that need to be pushed back on, but also to be able to recognize that everyone needs to have an opportunity to grow, because none of us are born knowing these things. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And this is something that I talk about frequently in private with people who I know who have, and who I'm very close with and who are very dear to me, who have a certain type of psychological profile, which runs toward being very black and white, and which runs toward having a very brittle ego. And these combination of things can make it so that, for example, in someone who has a borderline personality, doing something that doesn't match the self-perception of oneself as a good person, and then realizing that you've done something that doesn't match your perception of yourself as a good person, can lead to an ego wound, an injury of the sense of self, which is one of the hardest things a human being can encounter. especially if you have this idea that, or this perception that people are either all good or all bad, right? It's a very purity-oriented black and white mindset. You can either be all good or all bad. And if you do one bad thing, that must mean that you are a bad person. That can lead to someone realizing they've done something that doesn't align with their values, which, they might consider a bad thing, and then having this massive ego wound of like, this must mean I'm a bad person, so I either have to decide to reject the idea that the thing I did was wrong, or reject myself because I'm bad. That's really hard to sit with and process. It's really, really difficult. And, you can't change the way someone's fundamental psychological framework is. Or I shouldn't say you can't. I sure can't. I am not a clinician of any stripe, and I think that even clinicians would say that it's, at minimum, quite challenging. But what you can do is reframe the experience of realizing you've done something wrong as part of the learning process that moves us toward being the people we want to be. And there's so much healing there. It's like, I realized that in my conversation with you, I didn't say, oh, hey, there's a subject that we're touching on here that I want to take more care with. And I don't think I did something bad in that moment, but I do think it gave me an opportunity to say, in the future, I need to be prepared to say that. I need to be prepared to say, ooh, hang on, let me take a pause and think about exactly how I would approach this conversation if I was talking about it with someone directly affected and hurt by it. And I think that's true with so many things. I really feel for young people who are growing up on the internet with this culture of kind of perpetual permanence of mistake that says if you do something where people can see it and that thing is not aligned with the person you end up wanting to be or becoming, then the person you are is incomplete in some way. And also, by the way, you live in a fucking panopticon, so everything you do is happening where people can see it. A friend of mine told me the other day that a lot of young people don't dance unless the dance is choreographed and they've practiced it in private, because they know that they could be recorded at any moment. And I feel the same kind of sorrow about that I do about saying stupid shit to your friends and then your friends being able to say, whoa, hey, actually, I don't vibe with that, and here's why. Those are the moments when we grow and flourish in relationship and in community, and those are the moments when we become good dancers and experience the joy of growth and learning and movement. And I really feel for the young people who are developing under that kind of all-seeing eye.
It is something I've noticed with my own kids, particularly, I think even more with my daughters than with my son, that there is a real aversion to things that are sort of off the cuff. There's a real sort of fear of looking, the way the kids talk about it is being like, they don't want to be cringe. But I think that that's sort of like more deeply that it is a fear of being incorrect in some way. And I hadn't really considered the degree to which everyone's lives being so public all the time feeds into that. I think that's something that it's really interesting to think about. I have this tendency to, when I see people doing things that I don't understand or even that I don't agree with, the thing that I try to turn towards is being curious about that, like saying, why is this the way it is? Why are you the way that you are? Rather than immediately jumping to, don't do that. And it's something that I find, I've talked with other people about on this show and on my other podcast as well. We had a whole conversation about the ways in which particularly Gen Xers and Boomers talk about young people and why they are the way that they are. And the question is, for me, is always like, well, why are they that way? Mm-hmm. I think that there's so many opportunities to show compassion for other people and to try and think about how are the ways that we can take care of other people. But it really feels like that's not where we are collectively. I feel like, I try to be that way. I have seen you try to be that way, but it feels like the currency of the moment and of the moment for a while now has really been to be judgmental and to be critical. And I do think that a lot of that comes out of a very real and very important movement towards accountability, especially accountability for the powerful and the privileged. And that these are things that do need to happen, that kind of pushback, that kind of openness about the ways in which someone's behavior can be harmful or problematic. I also wonder what the long-term effects are and what the broader effects are when we live in a culture where the currency is, so much to do with the call out rather than the call in. I get uncomfortable sometimes talking about things like that because in public, as we are doing now, because I feel like the easy thing is to hear that, especially hearing a straight man talking about things like that and to say, oh, well, he is minimizing the experience of people who are more marginalized than he is. And that's something that I definitely don't want to do because, as I said, I think that this kind of accountability it's an important phenomenon. It's an important step in the hopefully eventual liberation of these marginalized communities. But I think that there is also my experience as an activist, my experience just being online, is also that there is a lot of carceral thinking. There is a lot of punitive behavior. There are a lot of people who have realized, whether consciously or unconsciously, that this is a way of accruing power and status to themselves, regardless of whether or not it's helpful or hurtful. It makes it a really tricky thing, I think, to talk about these things, to hold in our minds this dialectic of yes, the accountability is necessary, and yes, also that compassion and curiosity are also necessary. You know what I mean?
This line of this conversation makes me think of a very specific example. You mentioned the punitive and carceral thinking of kind of the cultural moment that at least a lot of our circles have been in for a while, that I do see us, I think, tiptoeing out of very slowly. And you said, I wonder what the long-term effects are. And it made me think of a very specific example. There was someone who was very popular on Twitter for a while, who I'm not going to name because I'm not particularly interested in a term search, like turning up a transcript of this and then me getting dragged into their mess. But people who know will know who this person is. This person would post 100 some odd long tweet threads dissecting every sentence of a book to find the problematic elements. And kind of position themselves in the public eye as a sweet, gentle thinker and dreamer who was just trying to have conversations about harm being done through, people using the wrong word or the wrong sentence or accidentally referencing an idea or on purpose referencing an idea without necessarily considering the weight that the idea they were referencing could have, whatever. And this person did this for years, made quite a bit of money through Patreon and stuff doing this. This was their sort of gig for a while. And then 2 years ago now, this person was outed, I guess, although I don't really like using that word here, as being an employee of one of the largest arms manufacturers and weapons dealers in the United States of America. And everything kind of fell apart, right? In that moment, a bunch of people said, holy hell, it seems like you don't actually stand for justice and liberation. It seems like you actually are participating in the machine of war and oppression, and how can you align those values? It seems like your values aren't aligned at all. And this person's gig of being the book dissector and the arbiter of what is or isn't correct in literature fell apart. But when this was coming to a head, I remember it's clear as day in my memory, which is rare for me because most things are clear as mud in my memory. I remember thinking about all the manuscripts that I've read from people where they were hedging so carefully. Everything that they brought up would be trying to make sure that they were acknowledging every single possible angle of problematic critique that could be levied against them as people for the things that their characters were saying and thinking. And I remember thinking, oh, I think this person is responsible for this trend in literature. I mean, they really directed a lot of cultural shift toward caution because these threads would go viral. Everybody would be, talking about how they agreed that a problematic thing was problematic and that it was bad and evil and that it could extrapolate to all these other ideas of the author having terrible, bad, dangerous thoughts. And I heard a little of that in what you just said. Mike, you said that this thing that sounded to me like something you and I both have to do as people who appear in public and speak in public, which is thinking of what the worst faith interpretation of your deeds and actions could be, and making sure people know that that interpretation is not correct. And that is something that I think this person who was doing these hundreds of tweets long threads pushed a lot of people into doing when they speak and write. You said, you're a straight man saying these things, and people might say that that you're minimizing the experiences of people more marginalized than you. And that's a framework that I find anti-liberatory. It's the question of who's more marginalized. Let's line everybody up and find out who has it worse and who has it harder. And make sure that we aren't forgetting who stands where on the ladder. And I do this all the time too. It's like it's necessary in a landscape where this kind of critique can come to your doorstep. I lived in terror of those hundreds of long tweet threads, because I write messy, gross, weird stuff. And I was like, when's my day gonna come? When's this person gonna come for me and decide that I have to die? And since they stopped doing what they were doing, I have been working to pull those weeds out of my brain of I have to make sure I'm performing my principles and ethics in such a way that people will understand that I'm doing my best. And instead I've started going, why are people who think that way allowed to lead our culture and our community? Why would we ever let anyone who says this person didn't acknowledge every possible way in which they could be misunderstood, therefore I am going to misunderstand them on purpose? Why would I let that person tell me what I'm allowed to write? And I'm saying that from a position of being, a pretty established author. I'm a lot less vulnerable than a lot of new writers. And that's part of why it makes me so fucking sad to see new writers trying to walk on this field of landmines that is also somehow covered in eggshells and not crunch anything or set anything off. And I'm like, it's the exact same way that I feel about kids being constantly recorded and monitored and not being able to be cringe, which is like a sacred right of childhood. You have to be cringe. I'm like, you guys are so hemmed in, and I think it's deeply unfair, and I think it's our responsibility across different, social areas to try to create more safety for people to fuck up and explore and make mistakes and then apologize. Oh my god. The apology reception culture of 2021 literally gave me nightmares. Or I would sit in bed trying to think of how to construct, if I messed up in any way, how would I construct the perfect apology so that people wouldn't end up saying, well, this is clearly disingenuous, this is fake, this seems too good, so it must be coached. This doesn't include enough information on how you're going to fix what you did. This includes too much information on how you're going to fix what you did, so therefore you're not actually sitting with the thing that you actually did. Like, it gave me hives. And, all I can do is continue, as you said, rejecting the carceral punitive mindset that says we can't let people try and do better. And instead say, yeah, people make imperfect apologies. Let's see what they do next.
Yeah. Well, and the flip side of that is, of course, that a lot of people don't make apologies, A lot of times that ego wound that you talked about is so all-consuming that people just are completely unwilling to consider the possibility that they're in the wrong. And this happens on really personal levels, like, I don't necessarily want to completely restate everything that we talked about before, but, in our previous conversation, I gave an example of a personal time that had happened to me. It also happens on big societal levels. I mean, I think that impulse to deny in order to avoid the ego wound is ultimately at the heart of a lot of huge geopolitical conflicts that are happening both domestically and internationally. The inability to see oneself as the oppressor is such a dangerous thing. And so it's such a weird thing, a weird time to be in where, even the conversation that we're having right now, you and I both are people who have spent a lot of our time, our public time and public speech talking about issues, talking about trying to raise awareness about things that are problems, whether that might be an individual person's problematic or harmful behaviors or systemic, societal issues. And I would say that both of us have and probably will continue to engage in, calling out injustice because it is a thing that needs to happen. And yet there is also this sort of fear of not doing it perfectly. There is the recognition of a need for compassion towards people who are apologetic. There's also, like I said, the recognition that a lot of times people don't make apologies. I think also about, in all of this, again, the question to me is why are we at the place we're at? I think about Brandon Taylor is a person, for example, who has written extensively about the way in which readers now approach fiction very moralistically, where every character needs to be some kind of paragon, or they need to be punished by the story for the ways in which they are not. And, Brandon has said lots of different things on lots of different topics, and some of the things that he's said are things that I agree with, and some are things that I don't agree with. This particular one I do find interesting, and I think oftentimes the way he tends to talk about these things, it might be in the context of don't do that. Don't do this to your art. Don't do this to your artists. But the thing that I kind of wonder, I guess, and the thing that story you were telling about that one particular person, I mean, I see people who are doing that kind of thing all the time. There's a whole account on TikTok that comes up on my FYP from time to time that's just their whole deal is your favorite celebrity a terrible person? And some of the times it's like, I mean, that thing that you're talking about just makes me feel like you've never been in a long relationship before. So maybe you don't know the ways that people can be can maybe compromise their values for love or for things like that. I don't know. I don't know if we need to be judgmental in this way, but the thing is that people are. And if people, especially young people, are more moralistic than they used to be, why might that be? How did we get to this situation? You know, what is it that's going on in the world and in our culture, in our both domestic and global cultures, that makes people feel like this is the way that they have to be? And I don't necessarily have an answer for that, but it is a question that I end up asking a lot, you know?
You know, you and I talked, when we had this conversation before, we talked about something called sin-flattening, which I will explain for your listeners, even though I know that you already know what it is. Sin-flattening is a phenomenon that comes up in high control groups frequently. It's especially common in like fundamentalist evangelical Christian groups, but really any high control group is going to probably engage in this. Sin-flattening is a dynamic by which a community is taught or decides that any one bad behavior is exactly as bad as any other bad behavior. So the example that I like to use for this is, we say that taking the Lord's name in vain is exactly as bad as murder. They're both sins. A sin is a sin. If you sin in one way, then you have done the worst bad thing. And therefore, if you take the Lord's name in vain, you should feel as guilty and vulnerable to punishment as you would if you had killed someone. And this is used in the converse as well, where, you know, let's say that the pastor of the church gets caught having murdered someone. Well, they can say, you know, everybody sins. I talk to all of you about the sins that you've committed all the time. We don't judge each other for things like that. And this dynamic is introduced into a high control group in order to negate each individual's ability to trust their own instincts about severity. So, you know, you, as a member of this high control group, you might take the Lord's name in vain and get severely punished. And because of this sin-flattened mindset, you won't have the instinct, hey, this punishment is way out of proportion. I think this group might be a bad place for me. And then again, conversely, someone in a position of power might do something really, really bad, and nobody really reacts to it because people say, well, you know, it's exactly as bad as this little small thing. And you won't be able to trust your instinct that says, hang on, something should have happened here. Something should have happened to address what they did. Or even just, I should get to react. I should get to have a feeling about what they did. Mike, you were saying, how do we get here? How do we get to this place where there's a TikTok account that says, is your favorite celebrity a terrible person? And I think that is reflective of a sin-flattened mindset. Because when I think to myself, so-and-so is a bad person. I mean, I have this all the time. I'm a fucking human being, right? Someone will do something that I don't like. Someone will, like a car with Trump flags on it will cut me off in traffic. And I think to myself, that's a bad person. Because that's what we do as a species. We categorize. We say, like, things are good and bad, things are safe and not safe. But there is a flattening that happens when you say, so-and-so is a bad person because they included an instance of problematic representation in their book that I think is indicative of some moral failing on their part. And they belong in the same category as someone who enables the perpetration of a genocide. This sounds like a wild exaggeration, but I mean, that is the kind of thing you and I are talking about right now, is people saying, you know, so-and-so is basically a fascist because their leftist ideals are slightly different from mine. And I would never want to take away from any leftist the time-honored tradition of exaggerational infighting and hyperbole in disagreement with other leftists. But I think some people are not approaching that from a perspective of, well, we are all going to the same place, but we gotta bicker on the way there. Some people, especially some young people who've grown up in this online, hyper-monitored culture who aren't aware of that context, who are like, no, there's like, almost everybody is bad people. And I'll take this a step further and say that makes people really scared that they themselves are bad people. And that they are just waiting to find out the way in which they are a bad person. And I think that's really scary.
That's basically where I live most of my life.
You know, I was there for a long time. I was, especially in like the first few years of my writing career, I'll tell you for free, I was shit scared of the moment that I would find out that I was secretly a bad person. And then I made friends with someone who, they might not mind if I named them, but I'll play it safe and not. An artist who I'm very close with, who I misspoke around once, and I said something that, doesn't totally align with my values, and I went, oh wait, hold on, I didn't mean that. What I meant was, and I corrected myself. And like an hour later, I was still having terror and anxiety about this. I was like, oh my god, I can't believe I said that. And I checked in about it, and this friend stopped me and said, Sarah, I know who you are. You don't have to be so scared. I get it. You said something that wasn't the thing that you meant to say. Don't freak out about this. And that was the first time anyone had ever said anything like that to me. And it changed how I approach friendships and relationships. I'm not friends anymore with people who make me feel scared that they are going to suddenly one day be like, you said something a little wrong. Actually, you're bad. I don't chill with those people anymore, and it's really made it a lot easier for me to develop a sense of trust in my perception of myself as fundamentally pretty good. I hope you can have that too, Mike. I think you deserve it.
Well, thank you. It's something that my friend Rachel Zucker and I have talked a fair amount about on our show together, and just in offline as well. That I think this is, at least in part, something that I come by as a feature of my particular flavor of neurodivergence, but that it can be a little difficult to, as necessary as I recognize it to be able to hold a dialectic, that it is challenging. And one of those tensions is that I find myself very mistrustful of the impulse for self-exoneration. And so I think that a certain healthy amount of doubt is kind of necessary. The people who are the scariest to me in the world are the people who are completely self-assured, or at least they act that way, because you can see that enabling all kinds of the worst harms, up to and including genocide. But even on a personal level, that the people who are the ones who are doing the worst things are often the ones who are very, very sure of themselves. And cultivating a certain amount of self-doubt seems to me a certain moral imperative, but something that Rachel will say to me, that she'll talk to me about, is this sort of addiction to doubting, that at a certain point, it's not actually a healthy level of self-doubt anymore.
I wonder if there's kind of something orthogonal to this, which is that maybe it's necessary to be able to trust yourself while still questioning yourself. I think of this in relationships between children and adults a lot. That, I want, for example, my niece to trust me, but also to feel able to question me and say, I don't think you're right about this thing, or I don't think we're going the right way when we're driving, or whatever. And I want to have that relationship with myself if I can. I want to trust my own judgment, but also be open to saying, you sure about that, bud? Especially because I'm quite mentally ill, and so a lot of times I have thoughts in my head that I should not buy into. But I wonder if there's a slight difference in flavor between self-doubt and having enough self-trust to be able to question.
Yeah, and maybe it's the difference between self-doubt and self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
But even that, I think I read something the other day that was talking about how everyone thinks that they're very self-aware and almost nobody is. So,
Well, then there's the difference between self-awareness and self-consciousness.
Sure.
One of them is knowing yourself and the other one is knowing what other people might say about you.
Yeah.
Which really comes back to that. This is the phrase that my therapist likes to use to roast me, is self-monitoring. When are we being self-aware, and when does that become self-monitoring? Installing a clippy inside your own brain, but the clippy is programmed by the meanest people on TikTok and is there to say, seems like you might be being cringe. Would you like to experience shame? And when are we doing that and telling ourselves that it's healthy self-doubt?
Yeah. There is something that can be very addictive and even kind of comforting in its familiarity about self-doubt and self-loathing and shame. It is at the very least something that is very dependable shame, that you can always count on it to be there whenever you call for it. And feeling self-confident, feeling good about yourself, feeling trust that people will still love you can be a lot harder to come by in a secure way. But
this is there's so much juice in this one. I have a book coming out in 2025 that is about a high control environment, what we commonly would call a cult. And for that, I did a ton of research into high control environments, which is why I've obnoxiously constantly returned to them. But this thing that you're saying about believing that people will still love you is a necessary component of high control group deprogramming and escape. Because what a high control group does is it tells you if you break the rules, you will not have access to love anymore. You will no longer have any point of attachment. It's why ostracism is such a strong part of high control group dynamics. Someone does something that goes against the group and they are cut out. And that's a demonstration to everyone still in the group. Hey, just so you know, love can be revoked if you break the rules. And that is so terrifying. It's also, and this, I'm not drawing any distinction between this and high control group dynamics because I think they overlap quite a lot. It's part of white supremacist ideology and cultural control, is this idea that there are a set of rules that you have to follow. And if you follow the rules, then you get access to whiteness, and you get access to the safety that whiteness claims to afford you. And a result of that is that, white people who are bought into this dynamic are very attached to rules and very attached to reinforcing rules for other people. And the rules are arbitrary. The rules are fucking made up because of course they are. But there's this cultural dynamic of you have to follow the rules. And a result of that is that rules become the comforting, safe thing. Shame becomes the comforting, safe thing because the shame tells you that you know what the rules are. You know how to follow them. You know how to stick to the script. And if you know what to say and what to do in order to be acceptable, and you can do that even if it's very painful for you to do it, of course there's comfort there. If you know what coin to put into the community machine to receive love, and you have those coins, great. I have total compassion for that mindset. I've been there. I still go there sometimes where I'll be like, yeah, I know how to perform in order to get, care and affection and comfort. But it's also so murderous to the individual and to creativity. God, creativity dies in the face of this mindset. It's heartbreaking to watch people take some creative endeavor that reflects the incredible, shining, unique brilliance of their heart and mind and soul, and then say, okay, but I have to make sure that I can cram it into this specific shape to make sure I'm following all the rules so that I won't end up being cut out of my community. And, I think there's, again, with the sin-flattening thing, God, I'm so on my bullshit. Again, with the sin-flattening thing, there's this idea that, there's no distinction between saying I should get to write racist caricatures in my work and name the characters after slurs and name my cat after a slur. And there's no distinction between that versus the idea that you can write characters who are messy and imperfect because one sin is the same as another. And if you do something that could look a little wrong, that's the exact same as doing something that actively hurts and harms other people. This is another piece of this, right? Is the weaponization of compassion. You've been talking about this whole time, Mike. You are caring and thoughtful and want to do the right thing. And there are people who will weaponize that against you and say, okay, well, if you're so caring, then you'll follow all these rules that I tell you have to follow in order to demonstrate that you're caring. And that shit breaks my heart. It's like people taking advantage of other people's desire to be kind and thoughtful in community, I think is absolutely vile. Especially when it's for purposes of control.
Yeah. Thank you for saying such nice things about me. I know that you would argue with me if I tried to describe them as compliments. But thank you. I do want to, again, be respectful of your time. So I guess what I would say is I don't think it's necessarily possible to come to a resolution or some sort of final statement about any of the things that we've been talking about. But is there anything else about this topic that you felt like we needed to touch on that we haven't gotten to?
You know what? I feel like we went into so many places that I didn't even expect to, that I could not possibly think to add more. But I do appreciate the invitation to add more. And, I guess the button I would want to put on it is to tell people, anyone who's listening who needs to hear this, or just if I can reach back in time to myself 5 years ago, you are allowed to be at any stage of growing into the person you are becoming and still have access to love and care and compassion from people who deserve to be in your life. And anyone who makes you feel that being in a growth process makes you fundamentally bad is someone who doesn't deserve access to your vulnerable, most intimate self. This extends to your community and to your loved ones. It doesn't mean that you have to let people hurt you because you're holding compassion for them. Looking directly into the eyeballs of my 5 years ago self, can you stop doing that? Stop letting people hurt you just because you're like, well, I have to leave space for them to be mean to me. But you can be in process, and that doesn't mean you don't deserve friendship and community and love and care.
Yeah. Well, the last thing that I always like to close with is to ask if there's a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you have experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yes, absolutely, yes. This is something that I have talked about on my newsletter. I've talked about it on social media. I'm so excited to talk about it here too. How Far the Light Reaches, A Life in 10 Sea Creatures. It's Sabrina Imbler's debut. It's an essay collection. Sabrina also writes for Defector, which is one of the best journalistic outlets online right now, in my opinion. And this is it's like a essay collection, memoir, examination of 10 different sea creatures and the specifics of their life cycle and biology and feeding and mating habits. And it's a fascinating, extremely insightful book. It includes this part that I've been thinking about nonstop. That was a runner-up for what's been on your mind lately. half of this podcast, which is the idea that joy is what we call joy is like the collective noun name for all the grief and unhappiness we experience over the course of a lifetime. And boy, howdy, I'm thinking about that every second of every day. So this book is incredible. I can't recommend it strongly enough.
Well, it's certainly been on my radar since I've seen you and several other people gushing about it in no uncertain terms recently. But I think I'm going to have to move it up my list. I've been trying so hard to make a significant dent in my to be read pile. Not even just like my queue of books I know about, but the actual physical, literal pile of books on my nightstand. And I have made a good dent. It is down below 60 books for the first time in quite a long time. But so I've been trying to not buy new books. But I might make an exception for this one.
If you're going to make an exception for one, I think it should be this one. And I'm saying that as someone who, as we're recording, has an ebook out today.
Yes. Well, the one that we talked about. So, which of course everyone should go. It's only $2. Yeah. Like, what do you got to lose?
Only $2, £1.27 if you're in the UK. Hopefully well worth it.
Yeah, it is. I promise. Sarah Gailey, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much, Mike. I can't tell you how much I appreciate this conversation, and how much I love this podcast. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. All right. As I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes to purchase a copy of Have You Eaten, which I highly recommend. I mean, it's less than the price of a McDouble. It's so much more satisfying. What have you got to lose? You can also find a link to Sarah's website in the show notes, which has links to their excellent newsletter, as well as all of their published short fiction and essays. It is all worth your time, so do check it out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider supporting the show by making a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are links in the show notes for that, and you can find all of the show's contact info, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechanneleopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back with a new conversation next month, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.